I didn't know any better, and like most people who are young, they have an enormous reserve capacity of health, so you can really abuse your body quite significantly and not really notice anything. So I don't really regret it, because there were very few people in the 60s and 70s who understood the fallacy of a low-fat diet and the absolute wealth of information and preponderance of anything. And this is well before the internet existed, or at least the web as we know it, because the internet came about in the late 80s or late 60s. So there wasn't access to this type of information. So I was on a really low-carb diet. In fact, low-fat diet, and I got my cholesterol down so low, it was like 75 at one time, which is just very unhealthy. So it took me quite a few years before I realized the fallacy of that approach. And I think probably it's one reason why I lost some of my hair. There's certainly some genetics involved with the DHT issue, and says, I've done the 23andMe genetics, and I realize it's a risk. But I still believe that if you can optimize your lifestyle strategies and diet, that you can pretty much optimize genetic expression. Well, I don't know that I noticed much. I've been involved in long distance running since the late 60s, and I've done almost 40 years of it. So that exercise kept me relatively fit, and I didn't really have any health problems. That's one of the unusual characteristics of my health journey, is that many people are motivated through health challenges that they have, like Dave Asprey, and they are then seek out to identify these strategies to help reverse that. That wasn't my issue. I was just always interested in optimization. But I just came to appreciation after studying health more and more, especially deep diving in nutrition, that this was not the right strategy. And it became very obvious of the flaws in the strategic thinking processes that came to that conclusion. Well, as you mentioned, many of us, especially if you've done deep diving into molecular biology, appreciate simple words to describe them. And powerhouses is probably the best simple word to discuss them. And, we require cellular currency, and that's usually in the form of ATP or adenosine triphosphate. And the mitochondria are the organelles that produce that. They're within each cell. Nearly every cell in your body has them. There's a few that don't, like your red blood cells and your skin cells, but they contain anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand. And more mitochondrial dense tissues, like the brain, the liver, and the kidney, have even more. So they're responsible for providing the energy that your body requires. Because if you can live without food for some people for several months and survive, you can live without water for maybe a week. But if you didn't have mitochondria, you'd be dead in seconds. Literally everything would shut down. You just drop, like if you could see a robot where they pull the power plug, it would be the same thing. So we require them, and what our appreciation is actually, most people don't understand that that we are actually very energy dense, even more so than the sun. There's a good book called Power, Sex, and Suicide by Nick Lane, who's a molecular biologist in England, and he describes and goes through the calculations that a human organism, that the energy density that we have per gram is about 10,000 times greater than the sun. So thanks to these mitochondria, we're able to do that. And they've been around for a long time. They eventually evolved into penetrating our cells. They were originally bacteria, but they evolved to around the time when we start having oxygen in the atmosphere, which wasn't always present, but they were able to take this oxygen and generate far larger loads of energy than you can from simple anaerobic fermentation or glycolysis that normal bacteria do. So it really gives us a leg up metabolically, as a eukaryotic organism as opposed to the bacteria. So they're amazing things. And most chronic diseases like cancer, which is really my primary motivation for writing this book, 1,600 people die every day in the United States alone from cancer. So, and I never really had great strategies to address that. There's a lot of different ways that you can look at cancer, but, once I read the book Tripping Over the Truth by Travis Christofferson, my eyes opened up and really put the whole ball of wax together for me and help me understand these. And I was on a crusade to summarize this information into an easy to understand process that could treat not only cancer but heart disease, the epidemic we have of Alzheimer's, and really help many children with autism, which is another epidemic that we're facing. So it's a very comprehensive approach, and it focuses on the nutrition, but there are some other interesting biohacks that I discuss in the book that can augment the benefits of a diet that's designed to help you burn fat as your primary fuel. And if we just look at simple statistics, 95% of the energy we store in our body, at least for most people, is in the form of fat. And only 5% in the form of sugar, typically glycogen stored in your liver and muscles. But the glycogen in your muscles really can only be used by your muscles. They can't be used systemically. So it would suggest that we should be able to burn this fat for fuel. And it was really an important biological adaptive advantage to be able to do that. And if we didn't, as a species, we'd die out because there were times when food wasn't readily available. So you needed this mechanism. In fact, frequent times. That was pretty much the pattern for however long you think we've been around as a species. It's only in relatively recent time that we've had the luxury of having access to food 24/7. So the ability to burn fat is a central core to staying healthy. And most everyone in the U.S., I would say well in excess of 90% of people have lost the ability to do that. And they're burning sugar as their primary fuel. So that is what causes the mitochondrial dysfunction. And it does it in a way because when you're able to burn fat as your primary fuel, you generate this type of fat called ketones, which is a very short-chain fat. It's water-soluble, produced in the liver, and easily penetrates the blood-brain barrier and is a magnificent fuel for the brain and helps reverse Alzheimer's. But these ketones, from a metabolic perspective, they burn very, very clean. And they produce significantly less of what's called a reactive oxygen species. And this is a sort of an artifact, polluted, necessary pollutant when you burn fuel, because the food that we eat is simply electrons for the most part. The fats and the sugars ultimately metabolically get converted to electrons and pass down this electron transport chain in the mitochondria and ultimately shifted and handed over to water, which is the ultimate electron acceptor. But in that process, it's not perfect. It's not 100%. All these electrons don't get passed undamaged to water. A significant number leak out and form what's called a reactive oxygen species, which is an oxygen with an unpaired electron, which is highly reactive and can form what's called a free radical. The free radicals then subsequently damage mitochondrial and cellular DNA proteins and cell membranes, which really are the core of most disease. So this excess free radicals. The key term here is excess, because many people, there was this free radical theory of aging by Denton Harmon, which is 30, 40 years old now. And many people hopped onto that and thought, free radicals cause the damage. Let's just hop on board with a lot of antioxidants. Well, that can be highly counterproductive because you need some free radicals. They're really important biological signaling molecules, and you can't indiscriminately suppress them without adverse biological consequences. So it's really far more useful a strategy to limit the unnecessary production or excess free radicals by choosing the right fuel. So when you shift to a diet that helps you burn fat as your primary fuel, you're not burning as much sugar, you're burning more ketones, and you generate far less free radicals without taking one darn supplement at all. I mean, it's optimizing your metabolism, and your whole process to generate energy becomes improved. And there's a lot of other fine details to this to even optimize it further, but that's the story in a nutshell.
And I think the challenge for a lot of people is they don't know how to eat fat. People are still fearful and still caught under the dogma of high fat being bad. So what does eating 75 to 85% fat look like? How can people start to look at this as a way to not only optimize?
Before I answer that question, it's important to clear up some confusion about this. And I didn't say that people should eat 80% fat. I don't really say that in the book. What I did say is that the intention is for people to burn fat as their primary fuel. And there is a transition process for most everyone that takes anywhere from a few weeks to a few months or even longer, depending on how metabolically crippled you are, where you're going to have 80% fat, maybe even higher. But that's not the long-term strategy. And you'll use that periodically, but ultimately you want to get to the point when you're burning fat as your primary fuel. Then you do something that really is relatively novel and not many people are talking about, which is cycling. I call it feast-famine cycling, where you actually have a large number of carbohydrates and you reduce your fat to maybe 50% or even a little bit lower and have more protein. Like today, and I think you do that once or twice a week, and that's focused around another strategy, which is important, especially as you age, that combats this tendency towards sarcopenia or age-related muscle loss. So it's really vital to integrate as part of your health equation some strength training practices. And on those days that you're doing that, you want insulin to be elevated. You want mTOR not to be suppressed. You want it to be an anabolic process and make sure that you're building muscle tissue. So on those days, you have some healthy carbs. Like today, I'll have 100, 150 grams of net carbs, sweet potatoes and berries and, other healthy source of carbohydrates and lower fat. That's something that really isn't very popular in the paleo community, and I don't think they've widely adopted it. Some people understand it, but it's not widely adopted, and it's really easily confused because you don't go on a high-fat, low-carb diet long-term because your body will think you're starving, and you will cause even more problems.
Well, that's what I like about, you bring that up in the book, and I think that's great because people do get caught up in thinking there is only one way of eating, and by increasing fat means restricting or lowering carbs. So it's really important. I like the fasting, feasting, and showing that the body also, it's very individual, right? Females,
Absolutely.
males, how much you exercise.
Absolutely. Yeah, and another strategy that we integrate, and before I wrote the book, I was really actually opposed to, but then I interviewed and I became aware of and interviewed Dr. Jason Fung, and you might have even had him on your show before, but he's a nephrologist out of Toronto, and he's written the single best book I've ever read, and I think that's ever written on how to fast clinically, and the title of the book escapes me now, but it's just Jason Fung and his fasting. I forget his precise title, but it is really good. And he discusses the benefit of fasting. And for many people, probably not most of your listeners, because I suspect they're pretty fit with your guidance and mentoring. But for the typical average American, 2/3 of them are overweight, so they would benefit from this strategy, is to go in to do some fasting. And you're right, that's where it becomes customized. You can fast for a day, 2 days, a week, even 2 weeks. And that can rapidly accelerate the transition to fat burning mode. And the important thing about, The Ultimate Guide to Fasting is the name of his book. And what many people don't understand with fasting, they become fearful of it, is as I didn't think it was healthy. So I think if you're overweight, it's fine. If you're underweight, it's probably a strategy that's not going to be useful for you, especially if you're fighting cancer, because there's something called cancer cachexia. But for most people, it's something to consider. And to understand that there's a massive difference between fasting and starvation. Fasting is voluntary. Starvation is not. So if for some reason, whatever reason, this is where it's customized, you feel, I just can't do this anymore. Well, then you stop. You're not a failure. You just stop. And then you have some food and then you go back on it later time. And it's a form of cycling. So you fast and then you eat food and fast. And ultimately, the more times you do that, the more you're teaching your body how to burn fat as your primary fuel and have this metabolic flexibility to do both. Because you want to have the full range of fuel choices. You just don't want to be restricted to using carbohydrates is your primary fuel. And when you do that, that's why people have these cravings. That's why they have hypoglycemia. That's why they want to have all these junk foods, because one of the most magnificent metabolic adaptations that occur once you start this program, I'm sure you've experienced it and probably have had many guests that talked about it, is that mental clarity that comes from feeding your brain the right food. But the even more magical is the absolute disappearance of food cravings. You just are not hungry anymore, or you're appropriately hungry. So when you need fuel, you get hungry, but you don't have these cravings for bad food. I mean, they just are gone. I've been eating healthy foods for decades and never experienced anything like this until I finally taught my body how to metabolically burn fat as my primary fuel. And it's been the most freeing and liberating, unbelievable metabolic transformation I have ever personally experienced. And it's been similarly to many of the people I've taught this, friends and family and relatives.
You can hear it in your voice. So let's talk about the fat. Let's talk about the fat sources. I like the fat bombs. First of all, I just want to mention that I just made a fat bomb the other day and it was epic. So let's talk about those and some other sources of fat that we can incorporate into the day.
Okay, well, before we talk about that, let's take another tangent and talk about what fat it's not, which I think is probably even more important because, we talk about 60-80% of your diet being fat. Well, if you choose the wrong fat, you can have a major problem. And Ansel Keys, of course, is the nutritional researcher in the 50s and 60s who is most people consider responsible for the establishment of the low-fat diet myth. But it was a response to a real epidemic that occurred in the first half of the 20th century that we had a massive increase in heart disease. And I believe it was due to fat. But this is the mistake. This is a perfect illustration and analogy to help set this story up in that they were eating, in about 1900, it was when the industry adopted the ability to essentially industrialize the production of vegetable oil. So not only is it omega-6 oil, but it's industrialized, so it can be oxidized, but you have large amounts of omega-6 fats. And then they were hydrogenating them to create trans fats, which weren't really banned until just a few years ago. So we had this enormous input of trans fat and vegetable oils that contributed to the heart disease epidemic. So that's what you want to avoid. You do not want vegetable oils. And many people might say, well, I don't eat vegetable oils. Well, if you're eating processed foods, you are eating oxidized toxic vegetable oils. And that's the last thing you want to put in your body because ultimately you're going to hopefully burn it for fuel. But many times you won't. They get incorporated in cell membranes and cause cellular membrane receptor dysfunction and a whole variety of other things. You've got to stay away from those things like the plague. They will probably one of the most toxic health food choices you can make. And I kind of look at what's one of the most toxic foods? I don't know if your choices, but my top two are French fries and donuts. Probably donuts being a little worse because they actually have the sugar, but they both represent toxic fats into your body. So you do not want toxic fats. So what fats do you want? Well, what do you think is the most important fat that a person can eat? We'll toss the question back to you. Then we'll expand on this because this is an important issue because this is the crux. You're right. 60-80% of your diet being fat, you got to get the fat right. So we should spend a little time on this.
I'd say essential fatty acids.
Yeah, which type? There's a lot. There's omega-3s and omega-6s.
Omega-3 in a higher ratio.
Okay, what type? You get in there.
Yeah. You mean the sources?
DHA.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. And how do you get it?
Well, you're going to have to get that from high quality animal protein or animal sources.
Yeah, that would be ideal. There's a lot, and I haven't followed your podcast, so I'm not sure, exactly what your previous guests have said. But there's a lot of confusion on this, especially in vegetarians or vegans. And I'm assuming you're not those, but
we're omnivores, yeah.
Okay, good. So because vegans will acknowledge that also, but they think they can get it from, if they're diluted, they think they can get it from essentially plant sources like flax, chia, and hemp. And that even though it does have omega-3, ALA, it's an 18-carbon fat, the conversion to the DHA, which you correctly identified as the most important fat, is relatively poor. Many of the case studies I reviewed is less than 5% or even under 1%. So you're not going to fill your DHA supplies with that. So then that's the low-level understanding. Higher level is that they try to get it from marine oils or marine algae as a supplement, and that's probably better, but it's not ideal. You really want it from whole food sources. Seafood, there's no question, no doubt, not a micro doubt in my brain, was one of the healthiest foods that humans could ever have. The sad tragedy is we had industrialization. So we started polluting the oceans, dumping mercury, dioxins, PBDEs, and it is a nightmare. So most seafood has become toxic. It will it will still provide the magnificent source of DHA, but it will also come loaded with a lot of toxic pollutants that you're going to have to ultimately detox, which is another part of the book. And we don't go into great detail, but that's, removing these toxic metals and exposures and other radiations like EMF is another crucial thing. But in the meantime, you've got to get DHA. And most people don't understand or realize that DHA is really one of the only fats that you could eat that your body does not burn for fuel. Now, I imagine if you had a massive excess, it would, but it's such a precious fatty acid that it integrates it into the cellular membranes and mitochondrial membranes. And you've got to have the highest quality sources. So let's go over to the source. How do you get your DHA? We've established that probably from plant-based sources isn't the best, although that doesn't diminish the importance of having ALA from flax. I have a tablespoon of flaxseed every day. And I think that's the lignans in there and some other of the nutrients are useful. But it's really crucial to get both, not just one or the other. So the idea, so most people, the vast majority of people get their DHA from fish oil, which would work. And it's probably better than nothing, but it's less than ideal for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's in a triglyceride form, so it's not well absorbed by most people, and that's why you get the fish oil burp if you have too much, because you're just not absorbing it. It's fermenting in your gut. So another step above that would be krill oil, because it has attached to phospholipids and some other good lipids that, aside from the EPA and the DHA, that like phosphatidylserine and phosphatidylcholine, that get integrated into the cell membranes and are important for brain health. But even better than krill or fish oil would be clean fish, clean seafood. So there's not many that are clean nowadays. The typical rule is the smaller the better. So sardines or anchovies. And interestingly, those make great foods that you can easily travel with, because most of us travel and we're exposed to less than healthy food options. So it's usually wise to bring your own food. And I travel typically once a month for several days and always travel with some sardines as my protein and fat source, and probably one of the other healthiest fats you can get, which is avocados. And if you got some avocados, 2 avocados a day is a typical choice for me. And would you like to know a simple way to travel with them, and also how to save 50% on your avocados?
Well, you shared it in the book, and I love it. I think our audience needs to hear it. Yeah.
Okay.
Share, though. Our audience will love it.
Yeah. So, right now, for the last month or so, it's just been crazy. I don't know if there's a Mexican shortage or something, but avocados are $2 a piece, and that adds up pretty quickly if you're having 2 a day. It's $4 a day times 7 days. You're $30 a week just for avocados. I mean, that's some people's food budget. So you can wait typically until they go on sale, because most grocery stores put them on sale, and then you buy as many as you think you're going to consume in 3 weeks, which for me is like 40 or 50, sometimes even more. And the trick here is to buy them rock hard and green. And then you put them in the refrigerator, and then you have to just do a little planning, which is easy to do. Figure out what you're going to eat in 3 days, and take out, recognize that it takes 3 days for the avocado to ripen, and take it out at the appropriate time. So I typically have 4 avocados ripening, and I just swap them out as I use them. And, as they become more ripe in the fridge, then at that time goes down to 2 days or 1 day, or you don't even have to take them out of the fridge. They're ripened in the fridge. But it depends, especially if you bought 40 or 50 of them. So that's a simple way to do it. And now if you're going to travel with them, ideally you would travel with them green and rock hard, and it's not an issue. But if they're a little riper, you can get these cardboard mailing tubes that are circular, and you just stuff your avocados in there. Typically, you can fit in like 8 or 9 in your suitcase in one of these tubes. And this way they don't get squashed by the airlines or TSA agents.
I love that tip in the book. And you touched on seafood and how it's a great source of DHA. One of the areas of your book I found most fascinating was the area where you dig into seafood and talking about the corruption in that industry. And I really want to take some time, because I think a lot of people may be avoiding some of these foods because they don't know if they're getting quality, healthy sources. So let's take some time here and let's dig into some of this stuff. Yeah,
that's an important point. For more details, you can go to my website at Mercola.com. And I interviewed the author of the book, Real Food, Fake Food, Larry Olmsted, who's an investigative journalist that really dug deep into this and found out that, the vast majority of restaurants, 80, 90%, or maybe even more, are the fish on their menu is deceptive. It's not labeled correctly. It may not even be the fish you think, especially if it's cut up. If they're selling you the whole fish and you can see it, and you're a fish, you have some savviness about fish species, you can figure out what you're getting. But that's not the way most fish is served. And interestingly, I was speaking to Dr. Klinghartz last week in New Jersey, and we all went out for dinner at night, and one of the guests ordered apparently healthy food choice, which would be organic salmon, right? Wow, organic salmon. Salmon's good, and it's organic's even better. I have 2 great things. So, knowing what I do about food, I said, there's no way you could sell organic salmon. It's just not possible. So I asked, I didn't order it. So I asked the waiter, how is this salmon organic? And then he comes back after talking to his manager and said, oh, it's farm raised. So they actually, by fraud or deception or just ignorance, had mislabeled that. And so people were ordering farm raised salmon thinking it was healthy because it was organic. So, but I'm not picking on this restaurant because it's pervasive. It's almost all restaurants do this. And here's the challenge with this is that there's no supervision on this. There's no certified agencies going around, and a restaurant incurs no risk or penalty of mislabeling. None. They won't be indicted for fraud. No one's regulating this. It's just crazy.
Craziness. So, Dr. Mercola, just to get this straight, a lot of times when I go and buy fish, even if it's at a healthy butcher that we have here in Toronto, sometimes the fish is labeled organic, and yeah, we know it's farmed at that point, but is this ever a good option?
I don't know that I'm not saying it's always farmed. In this specific case in the restaurant I cited, that was a scenario, that there may be some. I don't think that there is a standard for certification of organic fish. There's none that I'm aware of, which is why I was suspicious, and I asked the waiter, because it's just, if a wild caught would be the closest. Because essentially, but then if it's a large fish, it doesn't matter. It's still going to be toxic as can be because of the pollution in the ocean. So ideally, even if you're getting them from a really reliable, healthy, and I live in Florida, so we have a lot of good fish vendors here, but I typically don't get a lot of fish, and if I do, one of the tricks you can do is, because fish is such a healthy food, is that you can swallow it with a lot of chlorella before and after. And chlorella is a type of microalgae that is notorious for, or notable for, binding to these toxins like mercury and PCBs, so that you can enjoy the benefits of the fats and the other nutrients in there, because it has more than DHA and EPA and all these other fats to support that, but also has items called resolvins and protectants, which are pro-inflammatory important constituents to optimize your metabolism. So you don't get that in fish oil or krill. You got to eat the whole food. That's why it's almost always better to have a whole food strategy, and especially with the seafood. So, what does that come down to? Practically, I pretty much have a can of sardines most every day, and I'm going to have one in about another as soon as I'm making my salad after we finish this interview. So
I love my sardines as well. Just such a compact snack you can travel with. Oh, fantastic!
It's so inexpensive. And, the potential for fraud goes up almost exponentially with the price of the fish. And so since sardines are so inexpensive, there's not going to be any fraud in it. But if you have a really expensive Chilean sea bass or something, the likelihood that you're not going to get that is really high. The higher the fish, the more likelihood you're going to have something that's not what it's stated to be.
And you talk about, too, how we want to look for sardines that are in water and not olive oil, because I find a lot of them, they're in olive oil, so it's...
Yeah, most of them are, and thank you for reminding me. That's another topic that Larry Olmsted goes into his book, Real Food, Fake Food, is this olive oil deception. And you could be guaranteed, 80% of the olive oil sold in the United States is not really fit for human consumption. It's either adulterated with other inferior grades of olive oil, or even worse, some of these other oxidized omega-6 vegetable oils like safflower or sunflower. So to be avoided for sure. Not that I personally don't care for the taste and flavor of olive oil, but it's certainly notably a healthy oil, but you just have to be really careful and pick your vendors. And there's a lot of good suppliers in the U.S. actually, and California typically, that make magnificent olive oil. So it's not that you shouldn't have, just be careful. And you can almost be confident with a virtually 100% certainty that the olive oil they put into the sardines is not going to be a high quality grade. It's inferior, and you should not. So if you happen to, that's your only choice, then just wash it as much as you can, or rinse it off under the sink, and you have as little of it as you can. But it tends to be integrated in there, so you definitely want to get them in water. I tend to get my anchovies, which are virtually impossible to find without olive oil, except if they come heavily salted. So they can come like almost 50% salt. So then you can just rinse the salt out, but then there's no oil, just the whole fish.
Okay, well, a couple more things I want to hit on here, highlights from the seafood area of your book, is that the least contaminated, highest concentration in omega-3s, we want to look for Alaskan and Sockeye salmon. And the great thing about these is that they're almost, or in your book, you say they're always wild, so we don't even have to really look for that.
If they're certified, then I forget the specifics on the certification, but there's an Alaskan certification. So you got to make sure that certification is there because they're pretty rigid and actually enforce violation of that standard. So if as long as it's certified, you're going to be okay.
And lastly, you talked about being in Florida, local seafood there. You give a tip in the book, which is great. Buy local, or surprisingly, if you can't get local, look to the big box retailers. So can you explain why we'd want to do that?
Well, I'm just not sure why. Costco is actually the biggest, and I think they're probably the best with respect to enforcing their standards because of their large volume and actually commitment to high ethical standards. They rigorously enforce third-party objectives testing of the food that they're selling. So they will not sell something that's been adulterated. So that's a good place to get relatively inexpensive, high-quality olive oil. So if Costco's selling it, it's probably okay, which is an exception to the rule. But if it's your grocery store, but it's probably not, even if it's a high-end grocery store. But there are some specialty vendors that they specialize in olive oils, and those people, I'm sure, know what they're doing. They that's their passion, so they know exactly the details. But you just have to be cautious and make sure it's not one of the adulterated ones.
So we spend a lot of time talking about fat and carbohydrate. I think we really need to address protein because you really make the case for that we need to really watch the levels and the amount of protein we're eating. So can you explain this a little bit further?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the major differences between this approach and the pioneer who advocated this high-fat diet, which was Dr. Atkins. And he made the mistake and didn't really have the understanding of the dangers of excessive protein. And actually, many paleo people still don't get this, but it is significant. And most physicians have yet to hear of this because this is a metabolic pathway, probably the most important metabolic signaling pathway that exists in the body. It's called mTOR, which is short for mechanistic target of rapamycin, and maybe even more important than insulin. But it's actually mostly influenced by protein. So, and it's similar to insulin in many ways because when it's activated or elevated excessively, it causes damage. I mean, it's designed to, at least chronically, that's the key, is because you do want insulin elevated. You don't want it suppressed all the time. So, and interestingly, insulin and mTOR should go up at the same time, specifically when you're trying to strength build. But when it's activated all the time, like in many people, if they're eating too much protein, then it will actually, it's probably the most powerful signal to shut off something called autophagy or cell death, which is the way your body regulates and removes cancerous cells. So if that system is shut down, you've got huge problems. That's the biggest issue. But again, it's not chronic. So we don't say you have low protein the rest of your life. No, that's not the case. Once or twice a week, you want to boost your protein levels up. So what is the ideal level of protein? Most of the research strongly points to not exceed 1 gram per kilogram of lean body mass. So for most people, that's somewhere between 35, 30 even to 50, 60 grams. Now, if you're a 200-pound, 10% body weight NFL lineman, then that might be 80. But most people don't fit those characteristics. So it's the rare person who's going to need more than 60 or 70 grams of protein a day. And that's not grams of chicken or beef. That's protein. So you just have to look that up and do the conversion because, it might be 3 ounces of beef or 4 ounces, depending on what your size is. But 2 to 3 ounces is what most people need. And that's why the steakhouses have never been one of my favorite places, most of them, because they don't sell the right type of beef. They're selling CAFO, confined animal feeding operation beef, and it's not grass-fed. And it's full of these bioaccumulated toxins and from the contaminated grains they're fed. But even so, I mean, the smallest serving you'll find is like 6 ounces. I mean, you may find a 4-ounce serving, but you really don't need more than 4 ounces. So, I mean, some people are ordering a pound and a half, a 16-ounce steak, and that's just insane. That's like enough protein for like 3 days for most people.
Well, I'm glad you brought up, the different sources because people do get caught up in people are eating that much in meals. People are eating close to 30 grams in meals. So first of all, let's just clarify that you're saying in a day. So even for a female such as myself, it could be 40 grams in a day divided by 3 or 4 different meals.
You mind me asking how much you weigh?
110.
Yeah, so I think you sounded small. I didn't mean it to be deprecating at all. But so for 110, you probably, I think you're under 40 grams a day, unless you're really working out or doing a lot of strength training.
And I focus very much on the plant. as well. So I've got some animal as well. And then, getting the greens. And people don't think about the sprouts and the greens and the collards and the kale. Those are all
absolutely.
trace amounts of protein.
Yeah, they are. They're not much, which is one of the reasons why I think most vegetarians typically are healthier than omnivores, because their only source, if they're diligent, conscious, or educated vegetarians, that would be more refined, because they're having high quality food sources and they know how to pick them. They're not. I mean, you could be a vegetarian eating pizza all day long, or donuts. That's a vegetarian. So, but it's not just avoiding animal protein, but vegetarian sources of food are very low in protein. They're not protein dense at all. So they're getting these lower doses of protein, which actually optimizes their health. Now, you don't need a lot of animal protein. In fact, you may never have to eat beef. But I do think you need some sort of seafood on a regular basis. And people who don't are going to suffer. I really do, the long term. And the DHA, which I don't know if I go into the book, but because one of my new passions towards the end of the book was photobiology. But DHA is so important because you need to be exposed to the sun also. Regular exposure to sunlight is one of the healthiest things you can do, which is a violent contradiction to what's being preached by the dermatologists in the country. So you need sun exposure. Now it has to be sensible sun exposure. If you're Irish and you have absolutely white skin, well, it might be you don't go out for a half hour in the middle of summer at solar noon. It might be 2 or 3 minutes. You never get sunburned, but you need some of this. And why am I taking this tangent? It's an important one because DHA integrated to the inner mitochondrial membrane actually it's a chromophore. It will absorb these photons from the sun, and through a process called the photoelectric effect, will convert that energy to maximize mitochondrial production of ATP. So if you're DHA deficient, you're not going to be able to recover from any significantly serious chronic disease, because especially if you're seeking to integrate the photobiology component into the program. So that's why it's so important to get DHA right. It is absolutely critical.
I'm glad you brought up the sun, especially reading that part in your book too. Jesse and I just came back from Florida, and honestly, the therapy that it provides, just as you mentioned, walking on the beach, getting those negative ions and just being in that element, not only what it can do for your body, for your health, but just for your peace of mind. So I'm really happy you brought that up. I know light therapy is a really big part of what you're talking about right now.
Yeah, and then another part that I actually, because it's a journey, you're learning new things all the time, but I began to more fully appreciate after I wrote the book, was gratitude. I mean, not that who's not aware of gratitude? We all know the importance of it, but to aptly integrate it, and ideally many people recommend to integrate that as part of your eating strategy, to say grace or prayers or to be thankful for your food, but they become rote. But when it's a sincere, conscious, mindful effort, I think the benefits are far more profound. So what I found really easy for me is on my beach watches now, pretty much all the time, because it's an opportunity most people don't have. Everyone pretty much eats, but not many people have the opportunity to walk pretty much every day on the beach in solid sunshine. So I'm just express enormous gratitude to be able to do that. And to me, it's been a real profound experience, because to integrate that into my lifestyle, because I've known about it, but just never been able to practically implement it.
Dr. Mercola, you talk about how one of the healthiest foods out there is eggs, and you actually eat, and you eat a lot of raw eggs, which is different than most that are consuming these on a regular basis. So let's talk about why eggs are so good, and why do you eat them raw?
Yes, great point. Well, let me refine that, because actually didn't really include this in the book, because it's again, life's a journey. I'm learning new things. The book, if I was to write the book next year, is going to be a lot different. But what I currently understand, and Dr. Seyfried, who is really a big inspiration for the book also, he's a professor of biology at Boston College, and he wrote the book Cancer as a Metabolic Disease, which is like, this guy is the leader in the world in helping people understand metabolic treatment of cancer. But he reminded me in one of his treatment protocols for rats that he was using egg yolks. And I said, I hit my head, because I had stopped eating eggs for a while. But so I'm having egg yolks, typically 2 a day, and I'm very careful to separate out that albumin, because it's a very low quality protein and you really don't need it. But that egg yolk is where all the magic is, where, it's got many vital nutrients like xanthine and zeaxanthin, and which are bioflavonoids. They're important for retinal health, but a lot of other micronutrients and phospholipids. And when you put, Marnie, I'm not sure if you're doing this with your smoothie, but I would highly recommend putting 1 or 2 egg yolks in there. First of all, there's not much protein. I think it's probably 2 to 3 grams per yolk. But when you do the smoothie, especially if you're using many other nutrients, like we talked about the omega-6s earlier. I don't think you should have any vegetable oils, but you still need omega-6. Your body can't make it. But the way I get mine is from seeds. So black cumin seed, black sesame seed, pumpkin seeds, and a lot of the nuts I eat. So when you're using them in the smoothie, those seeds will break down. And obviously there's other nutrients other than the omega-6 fats, and there's a lot of other really important micronutrients. And when you're integrating the egg yolk into the equation, the phospholipids in the egg yolk essentially form a liposome around these nutrients, so you maximally increase the absorption of them. I mean, it's just like magic. Plus you get all the beneficial fats. It's a win-win-win.
So if you're going to eat eggs raw, though, you talk about in the book how we want to make sure that we look at our biotin levels, and this B vitamin over time can get lowered if we're eating raw eggs. Can you explain that a bit more?
Well, that's because there is a substance in egg whites called avidin, I believe is what it's called, and it can bind biotin. But there's enough biotin excess in the yolk to compensate for that, so that's why it's not an issue. But you do want to be careful about the type of eggs, because if you just go into the grocery store and get the cheapest eggs, it's going to be CAFO eggs, and not only is it promoting animal cruelty, but it's not good for your body, because they're not feeding them the right food. So you want to get them. Ideally, this is a food that's pretty easy to get locally, because many people raise their own chickens. So if you don't know the people around your neighborhood that are doing that, you can go to your health food store, and they'll typically direct you to sources where you can. But if you can't, there are many commercial grocery stores that sell pastured, not pasteurized, but pastured eggs. And that's easy to make the difference, because they sound real similar, but they're a world of difference apart. You do not want pasteurized eggs, and they do sell those, believe it or not, because of the people's fear of salmonella. But you're having a pastured egg and a chicken that's raised in humane conditions, getting under ideal conditions like we should be doing, then the likelihood of them having a salmonella infection is very remote. And the studies that were done are pretty clear on this. I mean, it's like less than 1 in 30,000. It's crazy. I mean, over a lifetime of eating eggs, you probably wouldn't even get the infection.
Is this why so many people are having allergies specifically to egg whites? Like, egg whites seem to be such a problem these days, even for myself. Like, I know that I react to them a little bit. Egg yolks, no problem. Can you speak to this at all, or?
Well, it's a specific protein, albumin, which is really not a high quality protein, and it's a very large molecular weight protein, so it's not necessarily easy to adjust. And if you have anything like leaky gut, which is really common in most of us, even if we're eating organically, but certainly if you're not, because almost all the crops are sprayed directly or indirectly with glyphosate, which bust up your tight junctions in your gut, which leads to leaky gut, so that you're absorbing these proteins intact, and they go and they cause these allergic reactions in your system. So there's not as much protein in the egg yolk and much more nutrients. And that's actually another, as I'm sure you and your readers know, the way that you identify a healthy egg actually is to look at the color of the yolk. It should be like yellow sunflowers, deep, dark yellow, not yellow, orange. I mean, orange. The oranger the better, because that means now they can fake you out, but in natural circumstances, that's because they've been eating many plants with carotenoids in there, which give it that color. But some of these egg producers aren't stupid, and they actually put coloring agents they feed them to the chickens to make people think it's healthy, and it's not. They're always trying to improve their sales and not necessarily pay attention to the health aspects.
That's where all the taste is as well. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about fasting and what you coined the term peak fasting. And a really important point that you talk about is stopping to eat at least 3 hours before bed. I think this is something I really want to really emphasize on. It's a great habit. You feel so much better. But let's talk about the importance of this and the window of time that's ideal for fasting during the nighttime. Well,
before we go there, why 3 hours before bed? So let's review some metabolic truths in that. What happens when you feed your body fuel is that you produce ATP. That's just the normal process. So, and as long as your body's using it, it's not a problem. But when you are sleeping, your need for fuel drops dramatically, absolutely dramatically. So if you've eaten shortly before you go to bed, you've got this massive fuel production, and this ATP has nowhere to go. It just backs up and it radically increases the production of these reactive oxygen species. So you're just messing up your system unnecessarily. You do not need to be doing that. Plus, many people have digestive dysfunction, and the last thing you want to do is have a big meal before you go to bed because it's going to cause some GI distress. So at least 3 hours. Many times I'm not even 6 hours before I go to bed. But we talk about peak fasting in the book, and that's my term for a very precise form of intermittent fasting, which I describe or coin as at least 12 hours between meals, between your first and last meal of one day to the next meal, first meal of the next day, and ideally closer to 15, 16, even 18 hours to really cut down the window of time where you're eating. And this has nothing to do that. You never heard me ever once talk about a restriction of calories. Of course, you don't want to overeat. You don't want to go eat 4,000 or 5,000 calories if you weigh 110 pounds. But eat sensibly, eat until you're full. Your body will let you know how much. But this is not a calorie counting diet in any way, shape, or form. It is a protein counting diet. You've got to be really diligent about that. And you need initially to count your net carbs, because most people are going to need to restrict. And net carb is your total carbs minus fiber. So you're going to initially, some people might need to go under 20 grams. Especially if you don't weigh that much. But some people go up to 40 or even 50 grams a day until you're able to burn fat for fuel. And if you're fasting, obviously you're 0, so you accelerate the process quite dramatically. But with peak fasting, it's just to retain that time period where you're not eating, and that does a dramatic benefit. I mean, it's almost as good as regular fasting, and it's a discipline that I do all the time, and I think the science supports it. I don't notice any downside. If I did, I would stop it, because when I started this process and started writing the book, I didn't understand the cycling aspect. It's something I discovered. I was wearing a 24-hour glucose monitor. It measured my glucose every 5 minutes. And my blood sugar started to rise, even though I was having less than 20 grams of carbohydrate, net carbs. And I didn't understand what the hell was going on. And I realized after digging deep that it was my insulin level was too low. And one of the most important metabolic functions of insulin is that it suppresses the liver's ability to produce glucose, a process called hepatic gluconeogenesis. So if your insulin level is too low, it doesn't stop that. But the paradox is that when you have a very low, suppressed, healthy insulin level, that if it stays low too long, it's a problem. And the solution is that you eat more healthy carbs. So I would eat 10, 15, 20 grams of healthy carbohydrates, essentially a whole day's worth in 10 minutes, and my blood sugar would actually drop because the insulin level would go up and shut the insulin level or the glucose production level from the liver off. So it's an interesting process. So it's just this cycling, listening to your body. There is no magic number of days that we can give guidelines, but ultimately it's something you need to figure out yourself and to do your testing. How do you know when you're burning fat as your primary fuel? You measure ketones. That's how you know. When your ketone levels are up, you made the metabolic conversion, and you can have that metabolic flexibility.
Dr. Mercola, I'm going to switch gears here a bit. And earlier in the interview, we talked about your walks on the beach, how you're out there getting sun, getting grounded. I want to talk about artificial lighting now and these LED light bulbs a lot of people have in their homes. Mm-hmm. What is this artificial light doing to our health, and what's the solution?
Well, it's a prescription for being blind when you're old. No question about it. We are on the threshold of an epidemic of age-related macular degeneration, the most common cause of blindness in the U.S. So why? Well, your body, humans, were never exposed to artificial lighting after sunset. The only light we've ever had since humans existed was thermal lighting in the form of fire, or reflected light from the moon, which is essentially from the sun, which is also fire. So only thermal light, analog thermal light sources. And these light sources, and even the early introduction of incandescent bulbs were pretty similar. That's a thermal analog light source, which is really low, really, really low. If you look at the spectrophotograms of that, very low in blue, very little blue, almost like a fire. It has more than a fire, but not much. And it's very high in red, near and mid-infrared, and far infrared. So all healing frequencies. But the danger of these LED bulbs, and I was an early adopter. I bought hundreds of these things, and when they were expensive, like $30, $40 a bulb, because they do work for energy. They reduce the amount of energy you spend. They're maybe 20 times more efficient than an incandescent bulb. But that's because they're not producing these far, near, and mid-infrared frequencies, which are not useful for vision at all. You can't see with them, but that doesn't mean they aren't important for metabolic health. So the fluorescents, which are pretty bad, and then the LEDs, which are typically even worse, especially the cool whites, have frequencies really high in the blue, and they're spiked. They're digital sources. So they have this spike of blue, maybe a spiky yellow or green, and virtually no red or near-infrared, and no near-infrared at all. Now, you can get near-infrared LEDs, but they don't have them in commercial bulbs. And just because a lighting source is LED doesn't mean it's intrinsically bad. It's just that the typical ones they use for lighting are horrendous. So one of the functions of blue light is to create a reactive oxygen species. That's what it does in your retina. And that's important. You need blue light in the daytime. You need a lot of blue light in the daytime. But you get it from analog sources like the sun. And the sun is full of the red in the near and the mid-infrared frequencies that balances out in the retina the damage that occurs from the reactive oxygen. So the marriage of them together is perfect. But when you have it at night, it's a disaster. So what do? You got to wear blue light blockers at night. I mean, you just got to. As soon as the sun goes down, I put my blockers on. Now, you can get them at Amazon for $8, UVEX, UVEX, and you can't get a better deal than that. It's basically almost free. Get them for everyone in your family, and just demand that they wear them, especially if you're going to watch this TV at night. Now, TV has its own issues too, but they typically have these really all the digital screens you have, your cell phone, your monitors, your tablets, TVs. They have this whole problem with excess blue light. So if you compensate for it when you put on the blue light blockers. And I think I wear them at night too. I call them reverse sunglasses because I actually wear them after sunset. I've always got a pair in my car. So if the sun goes down, I put in my blue blockers because what do you do when you're driving in traffic? Everyone's got LED lights blaring in your eyes, right? I mean, they're great for lighting up the road, but they're not good for your retina, that's for sure. So you have to pay attention to that if you want to preserve your retinal health. And who wants to be blind when they're older, and who wants to be demented, which is where we're heading. But there's if you pay attention to the light, there's some powerful metabolic benefits also that not only nourishes your retina but your entire body. So it's really important to pay attention to details and be diligent with your exposure to light.
All right. Well, thank you for explaining that in further detail. And before we wrap up, what we're going to do, Dr. Mercola, is we're going to go into a rapid fire question round and ask you some questions to get to know you a little better. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. First thing, what are 2 things, maybe even 3, that you do every single morning to get your day started?
Well, it's a whole litany. I just actually did the calculation of this. My more early morning routine consists of about 3 hours. Believe it or not. So I get up, I prepare my lunch, typically my breakfast, and my supplements. I count them all out. And then I will do my sauna. I do a far infrared sauna that's preceded by dry brushing and near infrared and red exposure. And in my sauna, it's low EMF and has satin, so there's no toxic materials in there, and I also load it up with ozone. So I do that, then I swim for 30 minutes or 15 to 30 minutes in the pool, which in Florida it can get cold. It got down to 45. So it's cold thermogenesis, which is another tool that we talk about in the book to optimize mitochondrial function. And then after that, and I'll typically do a series of a whole variety of different calisthenics that include ankle grabbers or type of sit-up, push-ups, pull-ups, dips, and exercise that I don't have time to talk about too much here, which is called nitric oxide dump. That's designed to, essentially, it's a type of high-intensity training just with calisthenics, doing jumps or deep squats, shoulder presses, and 2 other movements with your shoulders to get your heart rate up to pretty high. And dump nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is important to dump because it is really useful to inhibit platelet activation. It also improve your immune system and cardiovascular health. So do that 4 times a day. But and then after the sauna, then I may do a high intensity workout with live O2, which is exercise with oxygen therapy on my elliptical. And then I would either do that or I go to my personal trainer Then I do my email when I'm in my sauna, so I can multitask with that because the sauna has the ability to put your, I basically take my trackball in. The screen is outside. You don't want to put your computer in the sauna. But I do a trackball, which is wireless and goes through. So, and that takes about an hour and a half typically 2 hours or so.
Great. I'm glad you got into all the details. I have to ask, I actually looked at the back of the new book to see if you had in the index in the back, if you had the recommendation of what infrared sauna you're using right now.
No, we don't have one. I was misled last year about this time when I thought I found the ideal sauna. It was advertised as a full spectrum EMF sauna, and it's not. It wasn't. They don't exist, except for one, and one can actually build one themselves. And the book is Dr. Lawrence Wilson. I think it's Sauna Therapy is the title of the book. Lawrence Wilson. I think it's like $10 on Amazon, maybe $20. But he basically gives the details on how to construct a heat lamp sauna, which is an analog spectrum sauna. But, it's a little complex, and you got to use cages around it because these are heat lamp bulbs, and you could burn yourself real easily. So you can easily accomplish. That's probably the healthiest and least expensive sauna. We're actually in the process of developing one, but it may not be available for another year or two because of built totally out of the frustration of not having access to a healthy sauna. And this sauna, I neglected to say, is not a conventional wood sauna. It's a tent sauna. So my head's out of the sauna. And then I also have because I'm a male and have testicles, I put an ice pack in front of my testicles to preserve their fertility. Real important thing to do if you're going to do saunas on a long-term basis.
Interesting. I'd never heard of that. Good tip. So moving on here, you talked about gratitude earlier. What are 3 things you're grateful for right now?
Oh my gosh. It could be 300 things. But just to have the opportunity to have the level of success in life to really not be too concerned about the mundane things and people doing them for me, and have the opportunity to learn more about health was my passion, and help educate people and give them information on how to do that for themselves. Then to live in an environment where I'm able to optimize health. And just to be healthy. I mean, I don't have any health problems. There's really no major challenges I have. So I'm really grateful for that, and have the opportunity to help so many other people and to really have a purpose in life. I mean, that's one of the big things. I mean, I'm not grateful for the purpose, but when I reflect on it, it probably is, because I have a massive mission and purpose in life, which is, I think, crucial for being happy.
Sounds good. And you are accomplishing that, all the above. So what is something that drives you every single day?
Well, I think this whole thing, I mean, life to me is a massive learning journey, a learning experience. It's a journey. And I'm just excited to figure out what the heck new I'm going to learn, a new experience. This is like always learning. I was always reluctant to write my initial books because I knew they'd be outdated in a year or two, and that's still the case. I mean, but that's why we have the website to get the latest information out, and we update it on a regular basis. So, but I just love learning. That's one of my passions.
Something you've bought in the last year that you can't imagine living without?
Well, it actually goes back to the smoothies, and I used to use an immersion blender to make them in a mixing bowl. Then I realized what a crazy approach that was. Now you bought a NutriBullet; it's $100. I got the big one because my smoothies are a quart, still under $100. And boy, that has just been so great. Then I've also got a nice little high-end stereo system that I really appreciate because I like music, and I think it helps relax the body and the mind.
Can you break down really quick, what are you putting in your daily smoothie right now?
No, that's a long, complex question. I do go in that, and I'm lecturing at Dave Asprey's and doing my biohacks. I'm giving a 4-hour presentation, but it would take like 20 to 30 minutes to go into it and actually explain what each one is for to make sure people didn't get confused that this was good for them. But essentially, I can mention some of the highlights, which would be the avocado. There's really no specific protein sources. They just come from the seeds, which are black cumin, black sesame, pumpkin, flax, and then a lot of other nutrients I put in there that are specific for me, and I wouldn't want to confuse people about the thinking that they might need them. So everyone's individualized, and I've been doing a lot of study and understanding what my body needs and is optimized for, and I've done a lot of testing to figure that out.
Well, you do have a good recipe in the book, so if people get a copy of the book, they can see that.
Oh yeah, the other fat, I forgot some of the basics, is the raw cacao butter. A lot of people don't know about that, but very useful saturated fat. And I also use caprylic acid, which is a very specific type of MCT oil. It's C8, and it converts more readily to ketones. A little more expensive, but I use about a tablespoon of that a day too, and sweeten it up with stevia.
Is that the Brain Octane MCT?
No, it's ours. We have something called Ketone Energy, which I think is, I'm decent friends with Dave, and he's interviewed me, and I've interviewed him recently. Actually, the interview is coming out this Sunday. But I think it's a little less expensive than his and pretty similar high quality.
So this is no longer rapid fire. Dr. Mercola, you've given so much great information so far on the show, but what is one challenge that you can leave our listeners with? Something they can take on, implement in the next week to help them reach ultimate health?
Well, that's it. There's three things that you really need to do to stay healthy. And, I'm sure your viewers and listeners know about most of them, but it's to focus on your food. You want real food. You don't want processed food. So pay attention to the quality of the food. Listen to this podcast again and go into some of the details that we discussed. And then is to optimize your sun exposure, to get the right and light exposure. Stay away from the pernicious toxic light and get healthy light. That is key, and maybe almost as important is choosing the right foods. And virtually no clinicians understand or appreciate this. That is the missing part of the equation for health, is optimizing your light exposure. Just is not understood. And we're just at the cusp of doing this. I mean, even understanding things, how you can use infrared and near infrared light to reverse Alzheimer's disease, or reverse people who are on the transplant list for a kidney transplant, and using a simple light on their kidneys, reversing the whole process. So the potential for therapeutic application of photobiology is just unexplored. And then lastly is to move. You've got to move every day. You really do. I mean, I made the mistake of sitting down for 16 hours a day and exercising every day for at least an hour. We're in the gym. I did my deal. I thought that was all was needed. And then I started to understand that sitting is the new smoking, and that no amount of exercise is going to compensate for that amount of sitting. So you got to stop sitting and move around. Ideally 10,000 steps a day, maybe even more. There's some new evidence to suggest that postal workers do better with 15, 17,000 steps a day. So you're not going to do that moving around your house. You have to diligently go out. That's why every day I walk an hour and a half in the sunshine, unless I'm traveling or something. You don't have to be an obsessive compulsive Nazi about it, but you really want to move. And you want to move throughout the day. Not just, standing is better than sitting, but you don't want to stand all day either. You want to move. So movement as a deeper expansion of the exercises. So an hour in the gym is not going to cut it. I don't care what you're doing. You really need to move all day.
Great. I love it. We'll take 3. So listeners, you've got to get a copy of Fat for Fuel. And Dr. Mercola, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, we've established some pretty powerful firewalls, so they can't get a hold of me.
Where can they follow along? Shall I rephrase? If they're not getting your newsletter already?
Yeah, that would be the first best choice. We didn't go into details, but my website's been out for 20 years. It's one of the first natural health sites. We've been the most visited natural health site in the world for the last 12, and we have 30 million unique visitors every month. That's a lot of visitors, from every country in the world. So there's a lot of information. As I said, it's been there for 20 years. So we have a search engine box at the top of every page. So if you have a question, you could just type it in there, and you'll usually come up with dozens, if not hundreds, and sometimes thousands of articles that I've written on this topic before. So it's just pay attention to the date, because health changes, my knowledge changes, and we frequently revise and update our position on certain topics. So make sure you're reading the latest. But subscribe to the newsletter. It's free, and we have a lot of great details, that are even going to expand upon what you're hearing now. We expose a lot of the deception and fraud that's out there. Like recently, the EPA corruption with Monsanto, how these officials in the EPA have colluded with Monsanto to confuse the public and essentially falsify information. So this is the beginning of the end for these types of evil corporate giants who are focused on their bottom line profits and could care less about the health of people. They're decimating the world population by spraying 5 billion pounds of glyphosate every year in the world. So, and then leaving everyone with the health complications, try to figure out how to detox that.
Okay, Dr. Mercola, we're going to link up your website, your new book, everything over at ultimatehealthpodcast.com/148. We thank you so much for coming on the show. There's so much in this one. I'm sure the listeners are going to have to go back and listen a couple times and take some notes, because this is fully loaded. And just wishing you all the best on the book launch, and thanks again.
Well, you're welcome, but I definitely would echo your recommendation to listen a few times, because I listen to a lot of podcasts. I must listen to 10 to 15 podcasts a week. So, because there's so much knowledge out there, but the good ones I listen to twice. I couldn't recommend more, because there's just no way. Sometimes I listen 3 or 4 times. There's so much information in there. You only start to understand it by the third or fourth time.